Okay, so the real Mary Beth knows I'm from Fremont, but I have to give honor to North Bend, Nebraska, which is where I'm really from, as a little, up to age 3. And I say that because at this center table, as a surprise, there's a young couple, and the beautiful young lady in the orange sport jacket and her husband. I was in their wedding 40 years ago on June 12, 1971. And I don't think I've seen you since then. I don't think. But when they showed up, and I knew who you were, and I knew your wedding date. So I get extra brownie points for that. So I was originally born into a family of 5 boys in North Bend, Nebraska, and was raised, though effectively, in Fremont. But Lincoln, it's so good to be back in Lincoln, because Lincoln, as a Nebraskan, Lincoln is a place where I spent a lot of time as a kid. My 4 older brothers went to UNL. I made a bad mistake. I didn't go to UNL. That was like the one bad mistake I made in my life. But my mom and dad went to UNL. My brothers went to UNL. So Saturdays, as a child, we spent a lot of time coming to Lincoln to go to football games. And as a little kid, my memories of those football games, and this was the rah-rah days, back. In fact, my biggest connection to Nebraska football, I own a football signed by the 1970 national championship team, every one of them, and I still have it in a place of honor in our house. So I'm sure it's got to be worth something. I won it at a raffle or something like that. But as a little kid, we used to come. My dad had season tickets in the north end zone. We had those for years and years and years. And as a little kid, came many Saturdays to Lincoln. And what I remember as a little kid was going to 2 things, in addition to the football: the student union, to wait for the marching band, the pep band, or whatever you could call it, to come in and kind of lead to the game. And also, I don't know if they still do this, the red balloons. Yeah. Do they still do that? And I remember the excitement of being able to let it go, and I remember the real frustration of those games where you couldn't let it go for a long time. But under any scenario, I remember just the absolute joy of looking up into the air and just seeing this sky of red, and how great it felt to be a part of the Nebraska community. So it's great to be back here. Our family. I came to recognize 3 distinct things about my mom's letters. For starters, they were about the day-to-day events of her life. She could write 2 paragraphs about the plumber who had been working in our house the day before and was going through personal problems, elaborating about conversations, why she liked the guy, how much the total bill was. She could go into great detail about the new recipe she tried. She could give all the specifics about my brother's sporting events, including how they performed and what she wore while she was cheering them on in the stands. She could describe home improvement projects, sometimes sending small samples of fabric or carpet, along with a letter to give a better visual to the reader. She could describe what was blooming in her garden, how many hours she spent pulling weeds. She could talk about her boys, what they were doing at that very moment. Then she could proceed to talk about how many loads of dark-colored clothes she pushed through the pipeline, a song she heard on the radio, something different she was doing with her hair, or perhaps what happened with the dog at the vet that day. She described the day-to-day events in her life because those were the things that mattered to her. The second thing I remember about my mom's letters was the emotion that she was able to share. She could move from the factual information to vividly describing her feelings. And her emotions covered a range from absolute silliness to over-the-top tears of either sadness or joy. She could describe the pride she felt in witnessing one of her 5 sons' accomplishments. She could fully explain the hurt she felt when a child said something rude to her when she was volunteering at school. Her letters were a wonderful blend of facts and feelings as she took the reader on a mini journey of her world. She expressed herself beautifully, sincerely, and intimately. And the third thing I remember about my mom's letters were her use of the strike-through key, that dash. You see, the strike-through key, it sits directly to the right of the number 0 on her old Smith Corona typewriting board. It's a short horizontal line. Back when my mom used to use the typewriter, she had 2 choices for making corrections. One option was to use an eraser to try to remove the undesired word. While this worked, it often resulted in a big smudge, or worse yet, a hole in the paper. So the other option was to use the strike through over the undesired words. My mom used the second option a lot. But it wasn't that she used it to correct misspelled words. She was a wonderful speller. She used it primarily when she wanted to change the way she expressed something. Perhaps her original words were a little too strong, or maybe not strong enough. Or maybe once she wrote something down and then read it, she realized she didn't exactly feel that way. So she'd backspace, strike through the words or the sentences she wanted to replace, then type her new thoughts, leaving everything there for the reader to see. Every thought, even though she changed. She was happy to reveal herself completely. My mom was far from perfect, but what she was, however, was real. She was authentic and extremely content with who and where she was. Perfection was never her priority. Finding joy in the moment was. And suddenly my dad came running into my bedroom where I was with my friends, and he told my friends they had to leave immediately. You have to leave right now. And I remember as a 14-year-old, whoa, what, Dad? And it was very clear they had to leave, and these boys were out within seconds. And what he told me was, my mom was sick. Something was really wrong, and she had a headache. He kept saying headache. And it was a very blurry night, but she was quickly taken away in an ambulance. And they thought she had a stroke. She was 49 at the time. Fremont, they took her to Omaha to Clarkson Hospital the next day, and we're pretty sure she had a stroke, and we're treating her accordingly. Obviously, our life was turned upside down. This was our mom. This was the woman who stopped boys with snowballs from throwing them at her, and she was sick. Our bulletproof mom was sick. And my brothers and dad and I kept vigil there for several days and kept waiting for some sign that it was going to get better. And as a child, you can't go to those dark places. You can't accept what you're really going through with your parent. We would go in about maybe every hour. She was in intensive care, and basically she was not alert, and I don't know if it was a coma, I don't know if it was induced by medicine, but I do know every hour or so my dad would take one of my brothers, and we'd go in for a few minutes to just be with her and hold her hand or something. Every once in a while she'd open her eyes over those days, or she'd pucker her lips like a mom could do. And one of those times I was in there with my dad. I had bib overalls on because my stitches were still hurting. And my mom opened her eyes, and she took my hand, and she said, "I'm sorry, I can't take care of you anymore." And I remember thinking, okay, she's saying that because I just had my appendix out. That's why she's saying that. And I convinced myself that's why this woman is saying that. She died the next day. And our life was just turned upside down. This was our mom. So the next morning, I remember waking up. Actually, I never went to bed, but I remember coming down into our house, into this flurry of people that had ascended, because this was quite sudden. From the time she got sick to the time she died was 8 days. And this house was just full of people everywhere. And there were people, all of her best friends were in our kitchen. All these women, very familiar faces. And all I felt was incredible anger that these people were in my mother's place. They were touching her, her things. They were taking her, they had her apron on, they had her hand mitts, they had everything that was hers, and they were using her phone. And I remember just thinking, I can't breathe anymore. And I went outside and sat on our front porch just to be alone. And up walked another familiar face. It was a coach from the high school, Coach Applegate. He actually has a son here in town, Mary Beth, right? Coach A was the track coach for the high school. Not the track coach that I knew earlier, but he was my brother's track coach. Probably one of the kindest men I've ever known in my life, even though he was my brother's coach. And Coach A comes walking up, and I'm thinking to myself, and I didn't know Coach A that well. I was always the little brother to my brother Mick. And he walked up, and I said, Mick's inside. And he didn't say anything to me. He just sat on the porch, on the step where I was, and he did probably the most important thing a human being could do. He just sat with me. And he didn't say a word. And truthfully, it was really the thing I needed most at that moment, was just the presence of another person. And eventually, Coach A looked over to me and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he just said, "Your mom taught you a lot. And your job now is going to be to keep those stories and her lessons alive."